Hey there, welcome. Sean and Drake again, and we're back with a special treat for you. So today we're going to talk about weapons in Chinese martial arts. And that's a big topic, so we'll probably do a couple of these videos. So let's go ahead and get started. Feet together, step out, present, and down. All right, good. So in Chinese martial arts, most people think of Kung Fu as just punching and kicking. And few people know there's some Chin Na, some locking, some throwing, stuff like that. But really the heart of Kung Fu, actually these were weapons-based arts originally. So the empty hand was always to help your weapons training. And why do you think that is? Why do you think these were originally weapon-based arts?
Because everybody used weapons.
Right. So you don't want to take a fist to a sword fight. So this is good advice to remember. So back in the day, they fought with weapons, just like we fight with weapons now. So given a choice, it makes sense. Are you going to go bare hand, or are you going to use a weapon?
A weapon.
You're going to use a weapon if you have to, right? So, and of course people were smart, they wore armor too, so you had to have weapons that were capable of dealing with armor, and you had to have techniques which were capable of fighting against other weapons. You had to have techniques for if you lost a weapon. So that's what the empty hand was for. And then you had to have techniques to train your basic movements in a safe way. So there are several categories of Chinese weapons. We're going to talk about a couple of those today. So the first is one we're not going to cover, but that is your missile weapons, like your bows and your crossbows. So that's not what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the cold weapons, the hand-to-hand weapons. All right. So of course they had siege weapons and stuff like that if you get into that, but we're concerned right now with individual martial arts, not the military strategy or tactics. Now that said, many of the martial arts come directly from military training, and so the military weapons of the soldiers actually became the weapons of Kung Fu. So the main ones being the saber, which is the curved single-bladed sword, and of course the spear, but also the halberd. And so what we have are a couple of categories of the individual Chinese weapons, and they're roughly divided into two categories. So the first, these are your long weapons. So that's like your spear, your halberds, things like that. And so we'll cover those in a separate video. But today we're going to talk about the short weapons. And so the short weapons are basically your swords for the most part. And so yes, you have short staves and things like that. Those weren't military weapons normally. So you had two main categories of your short weapons. One is the straight sword, and one is what we would call in the West the saber. Now the difference is, and I have an assortment here. We're going to talk a little bit about them, but we're just going to introduce them first. And so before we get into actually putting hands on weapons or anything like that, I just want to back up and give you guys a safety reminder. Remember, these videos are only for informational purposes. So, anything that you do with this information is at your own risk. So keep that in mind, and always make sure that you consult with your medical professional before undertaking any sort of training or anything like that. All right, so let's move on. So first of all, when dealing with weapons, just like when doing anything, safety is important. You need to understand what you're dealing with. Always assume that a weapon is an actual weapon, that it's actually sharp, just like if a firearm is, always assume that it's loaded, that it's an actual firearm. Even if you think it's a training dummy, treat it like a real weapon. So right here, what you have, these weapons, with the exception of this one, are all training weapons. This weapon is custom designed saber. We'll talk about that in a minute, and it's actually designed as a weapon, with one exception. All right, So we'll start with the saber. The saber is really the most basic weapon that would be taught. It was carried as a sidearm. So the basic soldier would carry a spear and a sidearm, and the saber was that sidearm. And so we have a few categories. We have the training weapons, what we call the Wushu Blade. And so that's what this one is right here. And this is a reasonably well-made Wushu Blade, but it's quite flexible. Now this blade, I'm going to touch, and in general, safety-wise, you don't pick a sword up by the blade. I'm going to just show how flexible this is. The actual blade is not that flexible for an actual sword, but as a light training weapon, this is good. You have even flimsier ones that you see in Wushu. That's not so good. That's too flimsy. So to start with, you typically want a light, flexible, of course, unsharpened. Don't touch a blade. I know what I'm doing. Unsharpened blade so that you can train. Remember, when you're training, though, this is a piece of metal. So just because it's a practice weapon, if you hit yourself or someone with a piece of metal, it can hurt. Even though the point is not particularly sharp, I assure you it will penetrate skin. So you always treat a practice weapon like an actual weapon. So in this case, generally we don't touch the blade. In the saber technique, there are techniques for touching the blade where you reinforce the blade. That's common in the Chinese martial arts, actually common in the old Western martial arts too, European martial arts back in the day, knights and things like that. All right, so, but you need to know what's sharp. So you don't touch a blade on a straight sword, which has two straight edges. So that's what makes the Dao, this is called a Dao, unique. It has a single straight edge. This is a curved Dao. This shape is an oxtail Dao. Not really a military weapon. It's designed for cutting, easy to make, easy to learn how to use. They say 100 days and you can become proficient in the Dao. Now that's daily training, not I train once in 100 days, okay? All right, so in terms of nomenclature, this is the hilt, this is the guard, this is the blade, this is going to be the edge, this is the back of the blade, this is the false edge right here, this is the tip. In the West, we would call this the forte, and this the foil. Those are French terms, so this is the stronger part of the blade. Foil doesn't mean like tin foil, although this is kind of foily. It just means it's the weaker part of the blade, all right? So, point of balance is something that people talk about. So this one, point of balance is right about here on the blade. So you play, this can be fun if you have nothing better to do. You can just practice, see if you can figure out where your sword's point of balance is. Don't do that with a sharp weapon unless you know what you're doing. And then the point of percussion is kind of where you get the maximum force when you have a chopping strike, but you don't need to worry about that right now. This is the butt of the saber. So basic, you can break down, this is what's called a fuller. It's to take weight out of the blade, plus it looks cool. Sometimes called a blood groove. But anyway, so this is a good beginner weapon to practice with. And you always want to practice with a practice weapon unless you're specifically doing test cutting. You never use a live blade for your solo practice. There are very, very few people who disagree with that, but you don't use a live blade for your solo practice. Ideally, you'll use a practice weapon that's as close to the actual weapon that you would carry. Now, this day and age, we are not carrying a sword down the street or a spear down the street, so it's more for fun, more for training purposes. But you know, in our Kung Fu curriculum, we have knife training as well. So that's where you would start to want to put your knife close to something that you could legally carry. Anyway, a step above this blade is this saber. It too is a Wushu blade, but it's made, it's a much higher quality. It probably, you know, if this costs, say, 50, this probably cost 150, something like that. So it's still flexible, not so much, still fairly stiff. It starts out like as a real sword, but then it's just tapered way down here. Some people call this a Taiji Jian. Basically, it's just, Taiji Dao. Basically, it's just a Dao. It's just a saber, but notice the shape of the blade. It's smoother and less curved. So the Chinese call a single-edged sword a Dao. So they actually have completely straight single-edged swords. They look like a straight sword, but they're a Dao. And so this type of blade, if you go back to, say, the Tang Dynasty or Han Dynasty earlier, these were the inspiration for the katana, the famous sword, the sword that was made famous by the samurai movies. So that's that. So this has a longer handle. It can be used with two hands, all right, versus this is a single hand weapon. It's clearly this is single or double. And the ring there has usage as well. Now, a couple of safety things. When you're handling a sword, remember, always treat it as sharp. So if you don't need to touch the blade, you don't do that. You don't touch the edge. When you present a weapon to someone, you know, safety first. It's courteous to have the blade up or facing you. You present it, take it the way it's presented. If I use two hands, he uses two hands to take it. If the blade is drawn when I present it, don't present the blade towards them. So to the side or here, of course the blade's towards you. I tend to like to present it in a neutral way so that he can take it. All right. Now, we'll talk about details of how you grip the blade when we get into training the individual weapons. This is just an overview. So if we think of this is a good starter saber. This is a good functional practice saber that you can use day in and day out. This saber here is designed as an actual fighting weapon, as a military grade weapon. So I custom designed it. It's based on the willow leaf shape. The handle can allow for a second hand. So the weight's very good. It's heavier. This is lighter. This is lighter still, but it's not too heavy. All right. So this particular one, it can be sharpened, but the final step was not done in terms of the sharpening. So it is not a blunt weapon. It is simply an unsharpened weapon. So you still would not do a lot of practice with this weapon because the point is still a point, and the blade actually, if you hit something with it, it won't be so easy to cut, but it would still cleave just as well. So, like in the American Civil War with the model 1860 cavalry saber, they typically weren't very sharp. In fact, it was discouraged that they sharpened them because they wanted the cleaving action with the blade. So swords, no matter whether they're inexpensive practice or an actual weapon, are dangerous. Okay, so treat them with care and respect. Always pick them up by the hilt. Never wave them around. Never put them on the floor. All right. Now we're going to look at a couple of Jian here. This Jian, two-edged straight sword. So mostly what we think of as a sword in the West. All right. So both edges are sharp. We'll talk more detail. There's some differential the way it should be sharpened. Less sharp or unsharp up here, and more sharp here towards the point. Okay. So this one's still a pretty flexible blade. This blade you're not going to touch when you use it. So it's sharp on both sides. You're not going to grip it. This is an example of a Jian with a rigid blade. So it is closer to an actual functional weapon. This particular one is not super well balanced, but in terms of a rigid blade, so here. Between the short and the long weapons, you have kind of this category of long short weapons, right? So right here you have what's called a two-handed Jian, maybe comparable to a long sword in the West. So it's quite long, right? Why long? Well, it gives you better reach. So if you were a soldier and you were fighting a bunch of guys with spears, would you rather have a shorter sword or a longer sword?
A longer one.
A longer one, right? Okay. So, and then finally, this guy right here, this is an example. This is called a Miao Dao or Sprout Saber or Chang Dao, long saber, right? So this is the precursor to the katana, and then oddly enough, the Japanese, when they invaded China back in the 1500s, inspired the Chinese to revive this blade. This particular one is an overweight model. So when you practice with weapons, here, see how heavy that is. Yeah, pretty substantial. So when you practice with weapons, in general, you should start with a very light, blunt weapon. Even start with a wooden sword is fine, and that's quite common to start with a wooden sword, or even a stick is okay to begin with. It's safe, it's inexpensive, so if you're unsure whether weapons training is for you, whether you'll have fun, it's a good way to start. And then move up. When you get a Wushu blade, they're going to be light, they're going to be flimsy. At least make sure that they stay together. So I've been in class and I've had students that wanted to buy the cheapest thing possible, even if they were advised not to. And I've actually seen them come apart right in class. So always check the fittings, especially, this saber is not coming apart, okay? This saber might, so you just need to check it periodically, but the really cheap ones are likely to come apart. Then you would have ideally a weapon that replicates your actual carry weapon. The actual carry weapons weren't any heavier than they had to be. And why is that? Why do you think that a lot of people think they were just huge chunks of steel? Why weren't the actual fighting weapons like that?
Because it would be too exhausting.
Too exhausting, yeah. So the training weapons were heavy because it was a form of weight training. So you learn the technique with a light weapon, and then most of your practice is with what you would actually be fighting with, but a portion of your practice was with a heavier weapon. So if you can do the movements proficiently with a heavier weapon, put a lighter weapon, it seems like it's easier. All right? So this is a bit of an introduction to the classical short weapons. Do you have any questions?
Which one's your favorite?
Oh, that's tough. Because the first one that I started training with was straight sword. And so I have to say I have a soft spot for that. That's always kind of the iconic, the Wudang sage doing the sword fight with the straight sword, like Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. That's just really cool. But I have to say that I've come to really like the two-handed Dao. That's a weapon that is in the Tongbai system. It's especially associated with Baji. But it's a lot of fun. It's a very difficult weapon to use properly, but it's a challenge, and I like a challenge, and so that's a lot of fun too. So that's of these weapons. I have other weapons I like too, which we'll show you in a different video. also in the short weapon category, but shorter, like the Southern Butterfly Knives or the kukri, which we have in our Fujian system. Yeah. So, other question? No? Okay. So if you have other questions, you know, he knows where to find me. But you can drop a comment or send us an email. So what we're about to do is we're about to release our first weapons courses to the public. We've taught privately before, but we're going to be releasing this material on video. But before we do that, before we jump into the training, we're going to give you a little bit more of a tour, if you will, of the Chinese weapons. So in our next video, we're going to talk about the long weapons. So if you have any questions about this, drop us a note, and then we'll see you in the next one. We'll talk about long weapons, and then we'll talk about some of the exotic Chinese weapons. That'll be fun too. All right, feet together, step out, present. Good job.